Your father is known for being very tight with his money, but the holidays are right around the corner, and after a long year, the harvest was plentiful. Your father tells you and your siblings that you're headed to town, and after an out-of-the-ordinary spending spree, you're on your way to a local photographer, and your father tells you this is all a part of his Christmas surprise. Unfortunately, this isn't the only thing your father had planned for this surprise. Hey, hi, hello, happy Thursday. I am back with yet again another episode of True Crime with Kenz. I am your host, Kenzie, and today we will delve into a haunting and mysterious case that has perplexed investigators for decades, the Lawson Family Murders. As always, complete show notes are available at truecrimewithkenz.com. These include source articles and my overall thoughts on this case, and for this case specifically, there will be a couple pictures. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that these are real people and real tragedies that we will discuss today. Please be kind when leaving a comment or discussing this case on social media out of respect for the victim's family. This podcast is for educational purpose, and this is all information that I have found on the internet and I compiled into a single recording. All opinions in this podcast are mine and mine alone, and nothing should be done in compliance with the information found in this podcast episode unless otherwise stated. This case is one of the most well-known cases in North Carolina. There's a lot of information on this case, which is impossible to confirm if it's true. All of that being said, we do have a few disclaimers for this episode. Mentions of incest, child murder, as well as just overall death in general will be mentioned. So if that is something that you are not in the mood to listen to or is triggering in any way, please take care of yourself and I will catch you in the next episode. I promise I will not be offended. Go watch a cozy show, drink some coffee, drink some tea, whatever you need to do, take care of yourself. Let's get into today's case. The story begins with Charles Davis Lawson, also known as Charlie, which is what I will be referring to him as for the rest of the episode. He was a farmer born on May 10th, 1886 to Augustus and Nancy Lawson. He grew up, funny enough, living in Lawsonville, North Carolina. Charles grew up in a rural community, learning the values of hard work and resilience. Lawsonville is where he ended up meeting the love of his life. He met and fell in love with Fannie in his early years, and the couple actually married in 1911 when Charles was 25 and Fannie was 24. Fannie was known as a kind-hearted woman and was known for her nurturing nature. She was born in 1887, and she spent her childhood surrounded by the simplicities of rural life, dreaming of a future filled with love and a family. As Charles and Fannie began their life together, they started a family that would grow to include 8 children, although at the time this case took place, there were only 7 children alive. So I'm going to run through the children, when they were born, and then I will go through the ages as well. So the eldest of their 8 children was Marie. She was born in 1912, and at the time of this case, she was 17 years old. Sources noted that she was a promising young woman with dreams of a bright future. Arthur was the second child. He was born in 1913. At the time of the case, he was 16 years old, and he is known for his strong work ethic and helping his father on the family farm. The third child was William. He was born in 1914, but he actually passed away in 1920 at the age of 6 to pneumonia complications, so he was not alive at the time of this case. The couple's fourth child was named Carrie. She was born in 1917 and was noted to be a vibrant and curious 12-year-old, which she was 12-year-old at the time of this case. The fifth child was named Maybelle. She was born in 1922, so she was born 2 years after her brother William had passed away. It's said that Maybelle brought joy to the family with her playful antics. The seventh child was Raymond. He was born in 1927, and Mary Lou was the 8th child, and she was born in 1929. These poor children were just innocent souls caught in a tragic web of events. For reference, just so we're all on the same page as I go into the details of this case, the 7 children that were alive come as followed. Marie, who was 17, Arthur, who was 16, Carrie, who was 12, Maybelle, who was 7, James, who was 4, Raymond, who was 2, and Mary Lou, who was just 4 months old. Needless to say, Fannie and Charlie had a lot of children together, and while the older children were still young, the family was living in Lawsonville, where Fannie and Charlie had met, and while living in Lawsonville, they spent a lot of time with Fannie's family. Her family thought the absolute world of Charlie. Charlie had big plans for his family's future and took excellent care of Fannie and their children. So the first step in Charlie's master plan for his family was to move to Germington, and Charlie's brother Elijah and Marion had already lived in Germington, so Charlie's goal was to take his family and move with them down there so they could all kind of live in the same area. And this is exactly what Charlie did. So in 1918, the family moved to Germington, and Charlie planned to start a tobacco farm, which was the second step of his master plan for his family. So as I mentioned, his brothers were already down there, and when the Lawson family first moved to Germington, they were sharecroppers, which, if you aren't sure what a sharecropper is, because I wasn't entirely positive on what it was when I first started researching it, it's basically where you grow crops on someone else's land, and you live in a small house that's situated on that land, and your rent is charged through a portion of your crops. So you go through the harvest year, you grow your crops, and then whenever you go to harvest, the owner of the land where you're growing the crops as well as where the house is situated, you give them a portion of your crops from that harvest, and that cancels out any rent debt that may have occurred over the year owed to them. Charlie had plans to stay as a sharecropper until the family could afford to move into a house of their own. By 1927, Charlie had actually saved enough money for the family to purchase a property on Brook Cove Road in Germington, and this property was exactly what the family wanted. On the property, there was a rundown farmhouse, and when I say rundown, I mean run down. But the farmhouse was situated on a lot of land, and it already had a tobacco farm on the property, which, like I mentioned earlier, that was kind of Charlie's grand plan for the family, was to own a tobacco farm. So when this property became available and they actually had the funds to put down a deposit on this property, Charlie was absolutely over the moon. And over the course of the next 2 years, Charlie, Fannie, and the two eldest children, Arthur and Marie, spent all of their evenings renovating the farmhouse. And this portion that I'm about to mention here, it becomes more relevant as we get into the story, but I want to mention it here just for the timeline of events so you guys can kind of understand when this took place in reference to what we'll talk about a little bit later. So while they were renovating the house, Charlie was removing rotten timbers, so like support beams and things of that nature. He was pulling those out to replace them, and he accidentally hit himself in the forehead with his axe, and those around him say that he was never the same since this accident. Again, this is just something that I wanted to throw in there just for the timeline of events, because we'll talk about it a little bit later on in the case, but just so you guys know where this actually happened in the series of events relating to this case. In 1929, the family had finally got the house to where it was livable and comfortable for the family. So like I mentioned, it was a super rundown farmhouse, and they could live there, but it wasn't really nice. It was kind of in shambles. It was a typical, farmhouse that you would see in the 1920s that was, just abandoned, left to rot. It was shelter, it covered them from the weather and everything like that, but definitely wasn't to a point that they felt comfortable living there. But by 1929, they had actually got it up to a point that they were like, okay, yeah, we can live here for the rest of a while. So Charlie still had plans to build the family their own home from scratch, but that was just a down the line goal that he was working towards. So they had renovated this house just so they kind of had a place to live. It was already on this land, and eventually he wanted to build his own house from the ground up on this plot of land where the original farmhouse was situated. The family was well respected in Germantown and pretty much anywhere they went. Charlie was known to be a hard worker, and he did everything possible to make sure he got the most out of his crops at every harvest. And many people in the community said that Charlie was out working his farm until the early hours of the morning. And the whole family would kind of chip in to make sure that his farm was tended to the way that he wanted to yield the results he was hoping for. It was a teamwork made the dream work kind of situation, so everyone was a part of making sure that the crops were taken care of, the farm was tended to, and everything was just as it should be. Neighbors of the Lawson family say that they were the best neighbors you could have. If you needed help, if you needed anything, they would come and help where they could. So like if you were sick, they were the first person there being like, hey, do you guys need some soup? Do you guys need any crops? What's going on? If your house had caught fire, they were there, offering any support that they could, offering help to rebuild the house, whatever the case may be, they were there. And I wanted to mention this just so we could kind of understand like how the Lawson family was perceived by the community around them and just by their neighbors in general, because this does kind of feed into the case a little bit later, and you'll understand what I'm saying as we get further into it. So a couple days before Christmas, Charlie loaded his family, so this would have included Fannie, the 7 children, into his truck, and Charlie drove the family to Winston-Salem, which was about 13 miles away from their home in Germantown. And when they arrived, Charlie bought the family all new clothes, and this was a spending spree that was definitely out of the norm for the Lawson family. They were very tight with their money. They made very good money, considering the fact that, it was the 1920s, and he was a farmer. But they made really good money, but it was definitely not something that was normal for them to go out and just spend it on things. After the family had got their new clothes, Charlie told them all to stay in them because they were going to the photography studio to get a new family portrait, and said that this portrait was part of their Christmas surprise. And I mentioned this at the opening of this episode, and this Christmas surprise is the dirtiest of foreshadowing. I mean, we're on a true crime podcast, and I'm like, oh, dirty foreshadowing about a Christmas surprise. Wonder what that could be. But I do think it's very weird that he said, oh, it's a Christmas surprise. Like, I'm going to surprise you for Christmas. It's just, it's weird. But I'm going to describe the picture that was taken at this photography studio, because in my research, it was one of the creepiest things I have ever seen in regards to a true crime case. And it is like the carbon, or like the stereotypical like photo that you would expect to see from like the 1920s, but in related to murder. So just keep that in mind when I kind of describe this to you, which I will attach this photo on the case notes, but just so you guys kind of understand the creepy aspect of this picture. So it's a black and white photo, which was standard for the time, and the family is all standing besides the younger children who were sat on like a bench chair kind of a thing. So going clockwise, starting from the family members who were standing up, it goes Arthur, Marie, Charlie, Fannie, and Fannie was holding baby Mary Lou. And then on the bench is Carrie, Raymond, Maybelle, and James. And the family is all wearing dark colors other than Carrie and baby Mary Lou. No one is smiling. They're all just staring at the camera, and it almost looks like they're staring through the camera. They have these like straight faces. It's just very serious. And this photo was taken just a few days before Christmas, like I mentioned. So fast forward to Christmas morning, Marie, the eldest daughter, woke up before everyone else and went to the kitchen to start making her signature dessert, which was a cake. And in my research, I thought it was really interesting how this cake was described. So I'm going to quote you exactly what I read. Marie awoke early to blend butter, sugar, and egg whites, roll a cup of raisins in flours, and pour the mixture into 2 circular pans. Her signature dessert would soon be iced, decorated, and ready for the holiday feast. So basically, she made a raisin cake, and I just thought it was so funny the way that they described this cake, because I was like, so I'm expecting it to be this like crazy thing. No, it's just a raisin cake. But while the cake was cooling, Charlie and Arthur and Charlie's 2 beagles set out to go hunting. So where their property was situated, it was situated in the middle of like the woods. Like behind their house was like a wooded area. So Charlie and Arthur would go out and hunt here pretty often, and that's actually what they planned to do for Christmas Day. As the pair were hunting, they ran out of ammunition, or so they said. So this part I want you to keep in mind as I'm explaining it, because the whole reason that Arthur is not present for the rest of this case is because Charlie sent him into town to get more ammo for the shotgun, and Charlie went back home. So from the woods where they're at, Charlie sends Arthur to town, to Germantown, to pick up more ammunition for the shotgun because they have no more ammo for the shotgun. And Charlie goes back home with the 2 beagles. As Charlie returned back to the farm, no one knew that he had returned home. He was just kind of hiding in the barn, which is really weird. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing in the barn, but he had returned home. He was in the barn, and nobody knew that he was back home. Back inside the house, Marie was finishing up with the cake in the kitchen and kind of prepping for dinner later on. And her two sisters, Carrie and Maybelle, decided to stop by their aunt and uncle's. And on their way out of the house, they said goodbye to Marie, who at this point had finished with the kitchen and had gone to in front of the fireplace to curl her hair for dinner. And so the two littlest sisters, they're saying goodbye to Marie. She's getting ready for the day. And as they're leaving, they stopped on the porch to say goodbye to their mother. And in a couple of different sources, what she was doing was different on each of these. Most of the sources that I read said that she was peeling potatoes on the front porch. So in this version of explanation, that is what I am going to say she was doing, is that she was peeling potatoes. So just know that there were other sources that reported she was doing other things. So Carrie and Maybelle have said bye to Marie, they've said bye to their brothers, they've said bye to their mom at this point, and now they're leaving the property and they're going by the barn. And like I mentioned, Charlie was in the barn hiding out and nobody knew that he was there. So the girls go by the barn on the path to their uncle's home, and when the girls walked closer to the barn, Charlie kind of peeked out and shot both of his daughters. And to make sure that he was dead, he bludgeoned them to death with a hoe handle. So he shot them with the shotgun, both of them, and then beat them to make sure that they were dead with a hoe handle. So after murdering his two daughters, he kind of, pulled them into the barn and just hid their bodies in the barn. And it had just snowed at this point, so obviously, the blood and everything is going to be on the snow, and it's going to show where he had dragged his daughters into the barn. So a detail to keep in mind for later. So after murdering his two daughters and leaving them in the barn, Charlie came back to the house where, like I said, Fannie was sitting on the porch peeling potatoes for Christmas dinner that she and Marie were preparing. Charlie shot Fannie and then reloaded his shotgun. And upon reloading his shotgun, Charlie flung open the front door and stood in the doorway directly across from the kitchen. So the way that this house was situated, there was the kitchen, and then off kind of diagonally, there was the fireplace. So Marie was in the doorway to the kitchen, but right beside the fireplace. So she was in that general area. And as Charlie has opened the door, Marie has obviously just heard her mother get shot outside, and now she's standing in the doorway is her father who just murdered her mother. So she's kind of, like I said, realized what's going on because she's old enough to understand what's going on. And so she starts screaming, she stops curling her hair, and Charlie then pumped the shotgun and pulled the trigger, and Marie fell to the floor right in front of the fireplace. Charlie reloaded the shotgun again and shot James and Raymond, who were playing in the living room. And now this part is very sad. This whole case is sad, but this part it took me a second to kind of process it when I was reading everything in my research. So at this point, Marie is dead, Fannie is dead, Carrie and Maybelle are dead, James and Raymond are dead. So 6 of them are dead. So the only ones left alive are Mary Lou, Charlie, and Arthur. And like I said, Arthur was in town. So out of the 9 of them, only 3 are alive at this point. Charlie has killed 6 of his 9 family members. And this, like I said, this part it took me a second to process it. After he had murdered everyone else in the home, the only 2 left at the house were Charlie and 4-month-old Mary Lou. And without hesitation, Charlie bludgeoned her to death. And I'm not sure why he didn't shoot Mary Lou as well, because in my opinion, beating is a lot more personal than shooting someone. So I'm not sure if in his mind, beating his 4-month-old daughter was more humane than shooting her, or what the deal was, but he beat her instead of shooting her. So at this point in the case, Marie is dead, Fannie is dead, Raymond and James are dead, Mary Lou is dead, Carrie and Maybelle are dead in the barn. So I'm not sure where Mary Lou was. I'm assuming she was probably upstairs. So Mary Lou's upstairs. The two sons, the youngest sons, are in the living room. Maria's in front of the fireplace, and then Fannie is on the front porch, and then Carrie and Maybelle are out in the barn. So they're all deceased at this point, and it's just Charlie, and I'm sure at this point he's kind of freaking out, so he leaves the scene. And, everyone at the house is dead. So Charlie kind of leaves the scene because I'm sure he's freaking out, like I said. I've read quite a few different versions of who exactly stumbled across the family, but there was an article from Stokes County that state Charlie's brother Elijah was the first one that actually went to the Lawson family home after these murders had taken place. So he had been rabbit hunting and decided to pass by his brother's house, and he noticed that it was out of the ordinarily quiet. And there's 9 people that live in this house. So for there to be 7 children and 2 adults, 9 people total, for this house to be quiet, it was definitely out of the ordinary. And yeah, when you have that many children, it's very, houses are not quiet. So out of curiosity, Elijah walked towards the home. And like I said, Fannie was on the front porch dead. So at this point, he probably would have been like, what the heck is going on? Fannie's dead on the front porch. And he peeked through the windows and he saw the 3 children that were murdered on the inside as well. So Fannie's laying dead on the front porch, and then the 3 children that were in the living room kitchen area, they were laying dead on the floor as well. So at this point, Elijah's like, what the heck is going on? And, he's thinking, where's Charlie? Where's Arthur? Where are the other children? And he states that he ended up hearing something in the attic. And, at least he thought he heard something in the attic. So from his point of view, he's not expecting his brother to be the person that has done this. So he's thinking, okay, maybe the intruder is still upstairs. Maybe that's where the other children are. Maybe that's where Charlie is. So he immediately leaves the scene, goes to a nearby neighbor's house, to get help, because there's no way that he can, if this attacker has just murdered his brother's whole entire family, there's no way he can deal with this person on his own. This is clearly a dangerous person that he's dealing with. So he goes to this neighbor's house, and the neighbor actually reached out for help at around 4 p.m. on Christmas Day. At 4 p.m., a telegram was sent to Sheriff John Taylor, Deputy Sheriff Robert Taylor, and the coroner, Dr. Helsbeck, and Dr. Robert Bynum. I'm going to be completely honest, I am not sure if I pronounced either of their names correctly, so if I didn't, I am so sorry. They are very funky, and I looked up pronunciations of them, and I'm still confused, so I try my best. Just bear with me, I tried my best. But all of these people were urged to immediately come to the Lawson home because nobody kind of knew what was going on. They didn't know if there was an intruder in the home that had killed all of these individuals because, like I said, Elijah swore that he heard something upstairs, so they didn't know if the killer was still there. So everyone was kind of there was a sense of urgency of look, the whole family's dead. I can't account for, multiple people in the family just yet. I'm pretty sure somebody's upstairs. Please come immediately, ASAP. I need you guys to get here. So prior to the deputy and the coroner showing up, a bunch of different hunters in the area showed up surrounding the home because, like I said, the Lawson family was well respected in this area. So for the community to hear that something had taken place at the Lawson home, everyone was kind of there trying to help. And they, all these hunters were there, and they were like, listen, if somebody's here, we're going to take care of this. We'll take care of it, right? And so they were kind of planning on slowly approaching the home to figure out what was going on, what was kind of taking place during the situation. And a few of them went into the home, and obviously they identified Fannie on the front porch, and then they saw Marie, who was right by the fireplace, and then Raymond and James, who were in the living room, and then Mary Lou. They continued to search the home looking for Carrie, Maybelle, Arthur, and Charlie. So they were looking for those 4 because they had already found, the other 5 in the general vicinity of as soon as they entered the home. So they went up in the attic because, like I said, Elijah swore that he heard something up there. But as they searched the whole home, obviously there was no one else in the home. Charlie wasn't there. There were no strangers in the house. They couldn't find the other children within the home. So they're kind of like, okay, where is everybody else at? They've identified everybody that's in the house right then and there. And they're like, okay, where's everybody else at? So actually another neighbor is walking up from behind the house. So there's the house and then there's the barn, obviously, and then behind them is like other neighbors. So the neighbor is coming up from behind, so he walks past the barn first. Like I said, it had just snowed, so this was a white Christmas, and I had mentioned earlier that the blood and the drag marks were by the barn where Charlie had murdered Carrie and Maybelle. So this neighbor, as they're walking up, they see this like blood and drag marks near the tobacco barn that were going into the tobacco barn. So the neighbor was like, what the heck? And actually looked into the barn, and he was able to identify Maybelle and Carrie. Now, I have seen that all of the bodies were within the home, had all been brought to like a centralized sort of location with their like arms crossed over the tops of their chests, and they had pillows under their head. However, I do not know if this is true, and there is no way to confirm this because this case, like I mentioned at the beginning, was a very popular case in North Carolina for years. So I'm not sure if this detail was added to just kind of make the story more of a story and just something to add to whenever you're reading it in the newspaper and kind of being like, oh my gosh, like thank God they were all like, put together to have like their final resting place be together as a family. But I don't know, there was a lot of stuff added to this story, which is why I mentioned at the beginning there was a lot of information, and it's very hard to confirm what is true and what is not true. However, obviously, like we know, Charlie was the murderer. Charlie did murder his family, how he murdered his family, and so on and so forth. Like we know those are true, but at this point, this is where the details kind of get murky because there is so much information available on this case. So I wanted to mention that them being kind of put together in a centralized location just in case it was true, because obviously at this point it's the 1920s. DNA evidence is not really something that they're collecting because, forensics have not gotten that far in technology and like advancements and everything like that. So moving a body is not something that people were like, don't do it or your DNA is going to be on it. It wasn't something that they kind of didn't do at this point, so it is very possible that it is something that could have happened. So that's why I wanted to mention it just in case it was true. So at this point, all of the family members who were at the house, so we have Fannie, Marie, Maybelle, Carrie, Raymond, James, Mary Lou. I think I got them all. So the only two that are left still alive at this point are Charlie and Arthur. And Arthur is still in town. He has not come home yet. He is nowhere near this scene at all. And Charlie obviously has left the scene at this point. So at this point, all of the family members that were deceased were all there. Deputies finally arrive on scene, as well as the hearses driven by the coroners. And they're all there trying to take the bodies so they can get them to the funeral home so they can kind of start planning, running autopsies, things of that nature to figure out, confirm causes of death, so on and so forth. But at this point, there were so many people at this house. There was multiple neighbors, multiple family members, and a lot of people were at the home just trying to help the Lawsons, because if this hadn't have happened to the Lawsons and it happened to another family or another neighbor, the Lawsons would have been there trying to help. That was their whole thing. They were helpful, good neighbors. So everyone was trying to return the favor for them, not knowing that Charlie was the one that had committed this heinous act. So the deputies and the coroners are trying to get these bodies moved into the hearses, but this house is also situated on top of a hill. So it's very hard to get these hearses up the hill as it is. And then you have all of these people here on top of that. It's making it very difficult for them to move the bodies. Eventually, they did end up getting all of the bodies into the hearses and taken down to the coroner's office. And as I mentioned earlier, Arthur was not at the scene at all because Charlie had sent him to town. And I would like to pause here for a second because two things came to my mind whenever I found out that Charlie had sent Arthur to town to get more ammunition. The first thing that was on my mind was, okay, I wonder if Charlie sent Arthur to town to purchase more ammo, so it looked like Arthur was the one that committed this murder. And he had to go to town to get more ammo because he had just shot his whole family. That was the first thing that came to my mind when I was researching. But there also could have been the fact of Charlie didn't want to murder Arthur. And usually, your firstborn son at this point in time is, your golden child. You do anything under the sun to protect him. That oldest son hung the moon for most fathers at this point in time. So I'm also wondering if this was just a way to shield Arthur from what Charlie was planning on doing. But I did read that Arthur ended up coming home and seeing what was going on, but I also read that someone went into town and found him and then brought him back to the property and kind of told him what happened. So they went to town, found Arthur, told him what was going on, and then brought him back to the property. Either way, Arthur was eventually located, and he was the only child out of all 7 that survived. But he was safe, he was good, it was all good. So at this point, they have found, all of the family members. So they've got 7 family members in the hearses on the way to the coroner's office. Arthur has been found in town, but they still have no idea where Charlie is. So you've got the 7 family members on the way to the coroner's. Arthur's there trying to figure out, what the heck happened, and they're still trying to figure out where the heck is Charlie. So they still didn't know where he was until hours later. And like I had mentioned, there was the woods that was situated right behind the Lawson family home. And hours after, they had taken the families down to the coroner's office, they finally heard a single gunshot go off in the woods behind the house. Now, this is another detail that was pretty confusing because I saw it reported multiple different ways on multiple different sources. So the beagles that were with Arthur and Charlie on the hunting trip that they had just gone on and just came back from, I read that the beagles are what led authorities to Charlie, but I've also read that the beagles went with Charlie when he left the scene, and after he had shot himself, they started howling because obviously these are hunting dogs. They're trained to, whenever a gunshot goes off, they're trained to track whatever, that gunshot went to and notify the hunter of, hey, we found it. It's right here. Come to my voice. But either way, they ended up finding Charlie dead in the middle of the woods, and he was leaned up against a dogwood tree. And at this point, it was apparent that he had ended his own life. Now, when his body was found, there were 2 very odd notes that they had found in his pocket. And these notes were written on tobacco auction receipts. And one of them stated, "Trouble can cause," and then the other one said, "Nobody to blame but I." So there was these 2 really strange notes found in Charlie's pockets. Neither one is a full sentence. They're just kind of broken English put onto these little tobacco auction receipts and put in Charlie's pocket. So now that we've kind of talked about the case, talked about everything that has to do with how the family members were murdered and, what happened to Charlie, I want to talk a little bit more about the psychology and just the overall motive, if you want to say that, behind the murder. So kind of, what drove Charlie, who, he was a seemingly devoted family man, to commit such a heinous act? Was it financial troubles? Was there hidden demons? Was there a secret? What kind of led up to this being his solution to whatever was going on? The investigation into the Lawson murder actually revealed a few clues, but the motive remained inconclusive. Some speculated that Charlie had suffered from a mental breakdown, while other rumors pointed to an inappropriate relationship within the family. The truth, however, we don't know. We have no way of knowing, what the actual motive was behind it, because this case at this point has happened almost 100 years ago. It happened in 1929. It is 2023, right? So we're almost at the 100-year mark of when this case originally took place. So it is impossible for us to know, what was the real reason as to why Charlie murdered his whole family. So I wanted to bring up the head injury that Charlie sustained when they were renovating their home. Like I said, I wanted to bring it to you guys in the timeline of events so we could kind of look at, okay, this happened at this point. So I've seen a couple different ways that this happened, but the moral of this portion of the story is that a portion of Charlie's brain was taken out when they were doing the autopsy after his body was found, and it was put into a jar. And Spotwood Taylor took it to Johns Hopkins for further investigation. So they wanted to look at the brain itself and see if there was anything kind of going on there, if there was something that in his brain was showing that this is why he did it. Because a lot of the times, you'll see a tumor or something like that, and that will be the cause of someone just suddenly snapping and doing something completely outrageous out of nowhere when it's completely out of the norm for their, day-to-day character. So they wanted to take his brain and see if something like that could be the answer as to why he did this, but there was actually nothing indicated as unusual on his brain. So even the accident that he had with the axe to the forehead didn't really affect his brain. There was a little bit of trauma on his brain, but nothing that would have made it obvious that that was why he did what he did. So they did say that his brain was a little bit smaller than normal, so it was kind of underdeveloped, but other than that, there was nothing that they believed would have caused him to just one day up and decide, I'm gonna murder my whole family today. So there were other rumors that circulated around the question of why Charlie would kill his family, including speculation that he had witnessed an organized crime incident and that he and his family were murdered to silence them, because if Charlie saw it, then he probably told his wife, which then they probably told their kids to watch out for X, Y, and Z. So they were like, okay, maybe this, organized crime syndicate, whatever you want to call them, maybe they actually murdered the whole family and then made Charlie kill himself to just make it look like he snapped one day, killed his whole family, and then killed himself. However, in 1990, there was a book that was released or published that was called White Christmas, Bloody Christmas. And in this book, there was a claim of an incestuous relationship between Charlie and Marie. And according to the story, Stella Lawson, who was a relative of the Lawson family, she had been interviewed for the book, and she had called the author and said that she had overheard Fannie's sister-in-laws and aunts, including Stella's mother, Jetty Lawson, discussing how Fannie had confided in them that she was concerned about the incestuous relationship between Charlie and Marie. Now, more support came out for this theory in another book published by the same author in 2006, and this book was titled The Meaning of Our Tears. And a close friend of Marie Lawson's, Ella May, disclosed that a few weeks before Christmas, Marie had actually told her that she was pregnant with her father's baby and that Charlie and Fannie knew about it. Now, we have absolutely no way of knowing if these claims are true or not, and if these people were actually friends with the Lawsons or were actually attached to them. Now, like I said, Arthur was the only family member that survived this whole tragedy. And crazy enough, there was a lot of strange stories of phenomenons, curses, ghosts. It was rampant in the area. Arthur survived the murder of his entire family because he was out in town instead of being at home. But he was 16 at this time of the actual murders. And then in his 30s, he died in a freak truck accident. So in 1945, He was in his 30s. He was driving his truck on a nearby highway in Walnut Cove, and at the time they were doing construction in this area, and he drove his truck into a portion where the pavement had been totally removed, and he just wrecked his truck and died. And this is something that doesn't happen really ever. Like, if you're driving on an unpaved road, like, usually you're fine. Like, it's going to be a little bit rough, but you're not going to die from it. So the fact that Arthur did pass away from driving on this portion of the road that the pavement had been removed, it was just this huge freak accident that everyone was kind of like, okay, this family is cursed. Like, he should not have died from this situation, and here he is dead. But he was the only one that would have been able to confirm whether or not these claims were true or not, if he had even known himself. So later on, the Lawson cabin was demolished because there was all of this speculation about, the ghosts, the haunting, all of that, the curse. So whenever this cabin was demolished, interest in the case waned because there wasn't like a constant reminder in town of the case itself. The Lawson Family Murders remains one of the most baffling and tragic cases in American history, and it left a scar on the community of Germantown that has lasted for generations. Theories and speculation have come about, but the truth of what happened on Christmas Day in 1929 will never be fully understood. Like I said, we're 100 years past when this actually took place. There are no living relatives at this point that would be able to confirm anything about this case. But this is one that it definitely remains an enigma, and it's definitely a testament to the complexity of human mysteries and just the human mind in general. Like, what caused this man to snap? Was it that his daughter was pregnant with his child, or what was the issue? And I would just like to pause now that I have said that. The fact that incestuous relationships were so normal back then, like, as an avid true crime reader, I listen to a lot of podcasts on my own. I listen to a lot of YouTube videos on my own. I read a lot of books on my own. That it was so normalized back then. Like, obviously, like, people didn't want it to get out that it was in their family, but like a lot of the cases that you hear about from this time period, because we're in the Cold War era, everything like that, like it's shockingly normal. And I could not ever, in my mind, like, I just couldn't make that make sense. Like, if my husband were to be sleeping with our oldest daughter and I knew about it, my first reaction is to take my child away from that situation. And like, at this point, like, women's rights, it was not a woman's world. It's still not a woman's world, but it definitely wasn't a woman's world in the 1920s. So I get, staying and all of that, but it truly baffles me how frequently we see situations like this come up in these older true crime cases, and just true crime cases in general. Like, you see it a lot, and it's very heartbreaking. And, if I could just, take all of these children that are in these situations just out of it, I 100% would, but I do not have the power and do not have the means to be able to do that. But it is something that is just, it sickens me to my core whenever I'm researching these cases to hear something like that come up. And like I said, for it to be just as normalized as it was, it's just extremely frustrating and definitely pisses me off a little bit, I'm gonna be honest. I also wanted to take the time and wish everyone a Merry Christmas and Happy Holiday. Since this episode is coming out just 3 days before Christmas, it is hard to believe that we're already at the end of 2023. It feels like just yesterday we were coming into 2023, and now we're walking into 2024. I hope you all have a wonderful time. Spend lots of time with your family if you celebrate, and whatever holiday you do celebrate, if you have the opportunity to do so. But here is your true crime fix for while you're hanging out with them, and something for you to think about until next week. I'm very excited for the case that we're going to cover. I'm actually getting to interview someone, and I'm very, very excited for you guys to hear her story about her mother. It's a very a very, very sad story, and I'm so excited to be able to use my platform to bring more awareness to this case so we can hopefully see justice. I will, obviously, if you follow me on social media, you've kind of seen, what the overall topic is about, what the case is about, all of that fun stuff. But until then, thank you so much for joining me on True Crime with Kenz this week. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, do all of that fun stuff, because it does really help me out in the long run. It makes this podcast more available. People can actually see it, which does bring light to these cases. Follow me on all of my socials, which are also linked on True Crime with Kenz, to kind of stay up to date on, what the cases that we're going to cover, for all of those little sneak peeks and all of that fun stuff. But until then, stay vigilant, stay safe out there, and I will see you next time. This is Kenzie, signing off.